So we are joined tonight by some of the people from the city who have been working hard on updating the city's housing plan and identifying the locations for future housing that we'll be discussing tonight. And that includes Principal Planner Eric Lardy. Wave. We also have Senior Planner Scott Donnell and also Associate Planner Corey Funk. And they will be helping to serve as sort of your technical experts tonight as we move into the breakout sessions in just a little bit. We're also joined by a number of other city staff who are going to be helping us throughout the evening, making sure this meeting, the workshop goes smoothly. And when we break into some breakout sessions, you'll have a facilitator and somebody helping to take notes from the staff as well. So you'll get to meet some more of the staff this evening. Also joined by our community engagement and communications lead, Christina, are you there? Sorry, I lost some of my notes there. All right, well, so tonight's workshop, as I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and have Stacy pop up the slide. So I'll give you a little overview of what to expect this evening. Tonight's workshop is a chance to really better understand, as I said, where the community thinks we should locate about 2,600 future homes in Carlsbad to fulfill the state requirements that all cities in the region provide enough housing to meet anticipated needs. So if you want to go to the next slide, well, that's the outline for the meeting. No final decisions have been made on which sites will go to move forward with rezoning or into for future housing. All the input from tonight is really helping to weigh in on those decisions. So all the input gathered tonight, along with the online survey that's available, will be put together. Some of the sites will be revised, and then that will be going to City Council in early 2022. We've tried to make this presentation and workshop this evening as close as we can to a real in-person workshop. So hopefully you find that that works for you. You will get a survey afterwards, a questionnaire asking how the experience was for you tonight as well. Our meeting basically has two key parts. So here in the beginning, you'll have a short presentation followed by small group breakout sessions where you can provide more detailed input on why you think a particular site is good or is not so good for housing in the future. And then we'll have a report out of those and kind of do some sharing of what went on in the smaller groups. The second portion is an open forum. So that is a chance where you can actually raise your hand to speak, and you'll get to have 90 seconds or 2 minutes to make a comment or ask a question. We'll also be answering questions at that time during that open forum, any formal questions that come through. And then we'll close out the evening with just a few next steps so you know what is coming after you leave here tonight. This conversation tonight should probably expect to take us to about 7:30. That depends on how many people do want to speak in the open forum, but we're anticipating about 7:30. There are 18 different potential sites that we'll be reviewing or wanting you to give your input on. So we want this to be very interactive and lots of discussion ideally as well. And just a reminder, there is an online survey that will allow you to even dig a little deeper after tonight if you want to share some more information and walk through each of the 18 sites and provide input. So it's another way for you to give input as well. So just a quick orientation for Zoom. I know a lot of you probably have been on a lot of Zoom meetings over the last year, but just in case there's any Zoom novices out there, I see a couple hands raised there. So just along, your screen might not, all screens don't look different. So if when I'm describing location, if you see your choices somewhere else on your screen, that's okay. Different devices sometimes look differently. But in the bottom left corner, generally you'll see a mute and a video button, and those are for you to toggle to turn off and on your video and off and on your audio, your microphone. We do ask that you keep your mute button on unless you're speaking and during part of the public forum or in the group discussion, the breakout sessions. We will try to keep our cameras on. We plan to keep our cameras on during the breakout sessions and throughout the meeting. We welcome you to do that as well, but it's entirely up to you. There's also a participant button. So if you want to see who else is in the meeting, you can click on that button and it'll bring up a list of all the people that are in the meeting. There's also a view button up in the upper right-hand corner or somewhere where it'll say view, and you can click on that and that will give you different options of how you want your screen to look. So that might give you an option to see a bunch of the little cameras of the videos of folks in the meeting, or you can click on speaker view and then you'll see just the person that's mainly speaking. So you can play around and see what your your preferences are in terms of that. There is also a chat box at the bottom as well, and that looks like a little quotation box. We encourage you to use the chat to paste some ideas or comments, questions, anything that you have throughout the meeting. We'll be capturing that as part of the record of the meeting. We do ask that you not try to engage back and forth conversations, because we do worry that you'll miss something in the presentation or not be able to catch some of the slides. So just try to use it for just pasting in comments and questions, and we will get to those throughout the evening. And we're also going to take a chance with a little poll here in just a second, but we'll can walk through that when we get to that particular item. I don't see anyone on the phone, so I won't go through the phone instructions, but there are ways to participate in the meeting by phone as well. And if we do have anyone join by phone, we can provide some of those tools. If we do end up with any technical issues on our part, so if you see a glitch in the presentation or you get kicked off, just stay close to your email and we will send out directions as to what to do in that case. If you're having technical issues on your own side, so having some trouble connecting or having trouble hearing, any of those sorts of things, feel free to contact Sarah Lemons. She's going to paste her information in the chat there, her phone number. You can call her directly and she'll do what she can to try to help you out of that situation. So that's it for the housekeeping items. We do want to start by just doing a couple of quick warm-up exercises to get to know who's in the room here, the virtual room, and to allow you to kind of get oriented to the discussion for tonight. So the first question we'd like to have you answer, if you go to the next slide, you'll see a poll. So we're going to ask, what zip code do you live, work, or have a business in here in Carlsbad? And you'll see the poll will get launched in just a second. And those choices will pop up on the screen, all the different zip codes here in and around Carlsbad. So I think that poll was just launched. You should see that on the screen. All you would need to do is click on your choice. So you click on the zip code of your choice, and that will allow us to see who's here. I know you gave this information when you registered as well, so we have that on the other side for us to look at later, but we do like to see, so you can see who all is here this evening. Looks like we have right now about 35 or so responses. We'll give people another second. Okay, looks like we have everyone right now. I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. Let's see who we have here. All right, so we have a pretty equal crowd from 92008, 92010, and 92011. Couples from 92009 and somebody from other as well. So thank you for participating in that. All right, so the next little warm-up exercise we want to engage you in is using the chat. And so tonight we're going to be talking, of course, about housing and about housing location. But it's also about neighborhoods, right? When you think about housing, it's also a part of a neighborhood. So if you, in the next slide, you'll see a question pop up. That is asking you what you think are the most important features in a great neighborhood. So if you open up that chat box there and just paste in what kind of features you think are most important in a great neighborhood. So I see peace and quiet, parking. What else? What's important to you when you think of a neighborhood, which is where housing is, right? It's part of a neighborhood. Open space, good schools, walkable, more open space, safety, quiet and space between houses, traffic flow. What are a couple other features? Even density, safety, sense of community, community togetherness, more on open space, transportation, privacy, another one, transportation, all really good details. So when we're thinking about housing tonight and talking about housing, we want you to also think about the neighborhood as well. So it's all a part of the same thing. So we've got aesthetics, privacy, consistency, small community feel, more on safety, all great stuff. So keep pasting some of those in, and I am going to now turn over the presentation to Scott, who's going to give you an overview on why the city has to identify space for more housing at affordable income levels and how the map that you'll be providing input on tonight was developed. So Scott.
Thank you, Susan. Good evening, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time to participate tonight. And I want to reiterate a statement of Susan's, which is that the primary purpose of tonight's workshop is just to gather your feedback, collect public input on potential housing locations. These are just that for now. They are subject to much more study and analysis before we do any kind of rezonings, any kind of change to permit residential on the potential housing sites. Next slide, please. And to further emphasize that, we are in the early stages of identifying potential sites. The sites that you have perhaps already seen on our website, they do not have development proposals by and large. I do want to emphasize as well that the sites that ultimately we do study will be analyzed for anticipated impacts, whether that's an environmental impact, impact to traffic, impacts to school and city services. So rest assured, that's all subject to analysis that the city will do next year in 2022. And there will be more opportunities for public input as well. This really launches the first opportunity for that. The additional opportunities will occur throughout 2022 and perhaps into 2023. And also the soonest that any sites that we identify and that ultimately would be rezoned, that rezoning would not happen at the earliest until late next year or perhaps into 2023. Next slide, please. And this is a timeline. We are now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're collecting public input. That's a process that will stretch through October 22nd next month. The input that we gather through these virtual workshops, through emailed comments, through the online survey, all of that will be compiled and will be presented to the City Council at a meeting, we think early next year. Along with that input, we will be asking the City Council for direction from them as to the sites we should go forward with in terms of studying environmentally for impacts, school impacts, etc., and ultimately presenting to the City Council at public hearings late next year or early 2023. But there's an important step that needs to occur prior to that. As I mentioned, through next year, we will be conducting environmental review that will analyze the impacts associated with those housing sites. That environmental document will be released for public input as well next year. That information will also feed into what the City Council considers late next year or early 2023 as part of their public hearings. So again, there are many more opportunities besides this virtual workshop for you to provide input on sites. Next slide. I want to give you some background too to help just lay the foundation for why we're even going through this exercise. Why does the city have to identify sites for future housing? And it all really starts with the city's general plan and a component of that general plan called the housing element. The general plan is a long-range planning document. It really addresses how we want to grow as a city through the year 2035. And that general plan is broken down into different sections. One of the sections is the housing element. And that has a shorter time frame. It provides the housing strategy for the city through 2029 versus 2035. It's the only element, though, that's subject to state approval. Along with that approval comes a whole bunch of scrutiny, laws, and regulations by which we must comply with. And among those rules and regulations are state forecasts for residential growth in Carlsbad. And just like all cities up and down California, we have to accommodate a specific amount of residential growth that the state anticipates is necessary through the year 2029. Next slide, please. So the technical term for that growth is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. We'll talk about that more in just a bit. That's the estimate of growth in terms of residential units we need to provide for the next several years. Now, Carlsbad is obligated to simply provide housing opportunities. We don't actually have to develop any housing. We just need to provide sites, land, to enable developers to build that housing. One thing that we are required to do by state law is to particularly identify those sites. They need to be specific properties that meet state criteria that can be clearly identified, usually by an assessor's parcel number. They have to meet minimum sizes. In some cases, they can't be too big too large, but in all cases, they need to be sites that have been identified as potentially being able to accommodate specific densities. Densities is simply the term for the number of homes per acre. And as the state sees it, the more homes that can be put on a piece of property, the more affordable those homes are. In other words, density is a proxy for affordability. So as part of our site selection, we need to show sites that can accommodate housing at different densities. For example, in Carlsbad, the state considers a density of 26.5 units per acre as affordable to lower income families. The truth is, homes that are actually built in Carlsbad, regardless of density, tend not to be affordable to either lower income or moderate income families. And that's true throughout San Diego, simply because the cost of land here is so much. So when we talk about affordable housing, particularly in the lower and moderate income category, it's really based on density only, density that the state sees as suitable for those income categories. For units to truly be affordable, there must be some kind of program, a city requirement, for example, a subsidy, maybe some housing program that enables those units to truly be affordable, say, to a lower income family. Next slide, please. So the regional housing needs assessment, that's the technical term for our growth estimate. This is the number here that we need to provide in terms of sites. It's provided as a total number, 3,873 units. Those units are broken down by the three different income categories that you see here. The majority of those units fall in the lower income category. That means most of the sites the city needs to provide need to be at densities the state says are suitable for lower income. And I've provided two income figures to give you an idea of what lower income and moderate income means. For example, in the lower category, that $97,000, that simply refers to the maximum income that a family of four can earn to be considered lower income. That amount and below would be in the lower income category. A family of four earning up to $114,100 per year would be considered to be in the moderate income category. And any amount above that would be considered affordable income that's enabled to afford above moderate income households. Now, these income figures are adjusted for household size. Smaller families don't have to have $97,000. A larger family might earn more than that and still be considered to be lower income. Next slide, please. So we have that initial RHNA number, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. It was almost 4,000 units. Fortunately, we can subtract things like our existing residential land inventory, projects that have been approved but aren't built, residential projects that are pending. And from that, we can reduce the actual number of housing units that we need to find sites for. That's what we call this our target number, the target number for rezoning. However, we also need to add units to that. So on one hand, there's a subtraction, but there's also an addition. Based on state guidelines, we need to provide a buffer, an additional number of units in case the sites that we identify don't develop at the income categories based on their densities. So the actual target number is what you see here. The city needs to find sites for a little more than 2,000 units in the lower income category, about 550 units in the moderate income category, and as you can see, a total of nearly 2,600 units overall. This means the city of Carlsbad's existing residential land use inventory cannot provide these units. That's why we're seeking your input, because we have identified sites, but we need input on what makes a good housing site. What doesn't make a good housing site? How can we meet these units? Next slide, please. So what makes a good housing site? Of course, we're seeking public input. We've also have throughout the year 2020 through last year, a housing element advisory committee that met to discuss this particular topic, provide guidance to the city on the development of the housing element and the finding of appropriate sites. In addition to their work last year, we also conducted an online survey in August of 2020 in which the community was asked what makes a good site. Now, the interesting thing is the selection of the Housing Element Advisory Committee was different than the community input. The advisory committee identified city-owned sites or government properties as the best place to locate housing to meet that regional housing needs allocation. The public, on the other hand, said the best place to put housing was on industrial sites. So as you consider the maps that we put forward, you'll see certainly a mix of both government-owned housing that's pegged perhaps for potential housing, as well as vacant industrial properties. We also have as input and good guidance existing city policies, as well as state law. As I mentioned before, there are particular requirements that the state imposes on minimum size sites as well as maximum size sites that can be counted to provide housing units. Based on that input, city staff then is able to develop a list or a map of properties, and that's what you see and we're asking you to weigh on tonight, that meet the criteria identified by both the advisory committee as well as the public. Now, all of that information gathered last year, and we'll go ahead and look at the next slide, was presented to the City Council at the end of August of 2020 to receive their confirmation both on the criteria and the methodologies, as well as the sites that had been identified. We did receive that confirmation for the City Council. Public input continued to be gathered through last year, ultimately leading to public hearings before the Planning Commission and City Council early this year in March and April. The purpose of those public hearings was to adopt the city's housing element, its housing strategy. And as part of that housing element, there was a portion of it known as Appendix C, which is simply an identification of specific sites where housing could be located. And that really brings us to current day, which is to ask you to take a look at those sites and help us determine what locations are good and what are not so good, and what are some factors perhaps that we haven't considered. We did present this information as well to the City Council just last month. They refined the list of sites based on community input to include 4 additional properties that are not identified in the housing element, but are part of the maps that you've received and have seen as part of the online survey and on the city's website. We will continue to refine that list of properties based on the input we're receiving from you currently. And as Susan mentioned before, we will come back to the City Council in early 2022 with both the comments we've received as well as direction that we request from the city on the sites to study for land use changes. So next slide, please. So let's talk about the different sites that have been identified. And as I mentioned, there were 18. What you'll see on here is actually 19 sites, or at least site number 19. One of the sites that has been removed based on City Council direction, that particular property be designated as a low priority, and that staff seek alternatives to that low priority site. And on this map in the southwest part of the city, you will see sites 16, 17, 18, and 19, all of which have been provided as an alternative to the particular property, site 13, that they requested be designated as low priority. Now, this overall map identifies the different locations in the community from north to south, from east to west, which have been identified as potential sites to locate housing. And they're all color coded differently. The light blue color, for example, indicates property that is currently government owned that could be developed residentially. The yellow color indicates properties already designated for residential use that could be rezoned perhaps to allow more housing units. And let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples on the next slide. So this first slide here identifies property at the north end of the city, adjacent to the city of Oceanside. The first site you see there, site 1, is a dark blue color to indicate this is a proposal to designate the property from its existing commercial designation to residential. We actually have a pending application on this property to build 240 units. This particular property is the site today of the Marshall Shopping Center, Navy Federal Credit Union, and the Olive Garden restaurant. The proposal is to remove some of the commercial buildings there and develop it with apartments. Adjacent to this site number 1 is the second site, and this is, as you probably know, the Forum Shops. What you may not know is that the property around the buildings here, around the mall, is actually owned by the city of Carlsbad, about 57 acres. This represents a potential location for housing to be built and probably other uses like parking structures and additional commercial uses. Next slide, please. If we move down south from the north end of the city to along Palomar Airport Road, here identifies 4 vacant industrial properties that could be converted to high-density residential uses. The first 2 properties on the left part of the slide are in the Bressi Ranch area. The last 2 properties to the east of Melrose on the right hand of the slide are in a development known as Palomar Forum. 4 vacant industrial properties that could potentially be residentially designated. And then the next slide identifies a few more properties also to the south of Palomar Airport Road. The property on the right, site number 8, is designated with an orange color to indicate that it could be a property currently designated for low density residential and potentially upzoned to a higher density residential. The 2 properties on the left actually are a Caltrans maintenance yard accessed off of Paseo del Norte, as well as Pacific Sales retail building. Potentially, these sites could be redeveloped from their current public or commercial status to high residential properties, high density residential properties. And the next slide, please. So we've talked about densities, figures. I want to give you some real life examples of what projects look like at various densities. And in the state's eyes, again, the lower the density, the less affordable the unit is. Here is an example of detached single family housing in the Robertson Ranch project of the city. Just based on appearance alone, it's probably no surprise that this is a good example of housing that would be considered affordable to above moderate income families. We take a look at the next slide. This is the Bluffs Condominium Project located just south of Tamarack and just north of Agua Hedionda Lagoon. At the density stated here, 14.6 units per acre, the state would consider something built on this property as being affordable to moderate income housing. The truth is, though, that because of its coastal location, proximity to the beach, to the lagoon, the housing built here is not affordable to moderate incomes. Instead, it's largely market rate, and it's only through projects or programs such as the city's inclusionary requirement that only a percentage of these units are truly considered affordable housing, rent restricted or restricted to ownership to people with lower or moderate incomes. And the next slide, this is a project in our village along Carlsbad Boulevard, known as Village by the Sea. At nearly 23 units per acre, again, the state would consider this to be property at which moderate income housing would be built. But if you're familiar with this location, its proximity to the beach, you know it's a highly desirable area. The property units that would be built here based on land costs alone would justify certainly above moderate income housing. And again, it's only through a program or requirement that a percentage of these units are actually set aside to be truly affordable housing. And the last slide is a good example of a senior apartment project in the city's Barrio area, located just to the west of I-5 along Harding Street. This truly is an affordable project. At 50 units per acre, all of the units here are occupied by seniors with lower incomes. But again, it's an example of restrictions, of requirements that have been put in place to ensure that occupancy is restricted to indeed lower income families. And the next slide is just kind of a summary, and it's at a small scale, and it's difficult to figure out or identify everything that's presented here. But what the information is trying to convey with this map is that Carlsbad has for 20 plus years developed a number of affordable housing projects throughout the community. That's what the different colors represent. The different colors also represent potential housing projects, sites that we're discussing tonight, for example, as well as currently vacant land that is designated at densities that could be developed with affordable housing. So as you can see, affordable housing isn't concentrated just in any particular part of the city. Instead, it is scattered throughout the community. And with that, I think the next slide, I will turn that rest of the presentation over to Susan.
Great, thank you, Scott. And thanks to everyone for all of the activity in the chat. We appreciate all the comments going in there. We are keeping track of all of the questions in the chat as well, and we will provide answers to those after the breakout session. So we're documenting all of those, and we'll give you some thoughts. You can also Feel free to pose those questions in your individual breakout sessions as well, if that's something that you would like to get an answer to right away on some of those. But now that you have an idea of how and why the sites were selected as possible options, we want you to have a chance to really explore and dig in a little bit deeper and talk about them in a smaller group setting and tell us what you think about them. So we're going to put you into breakout sessions, and you don't have to do anything. You'll just automatically be moved into a group with a facilitator and a note taker from the city and about 5 to 7 community members and other stakeholders with you. And we're going to ask you to think about these 2 questions. So which sites do you think are good locations for housing and why? And the why is really important on both the why you think they're good and why you think they're not so good. We really want to hear more details about some of your thoughts around that. So if you'd like to focus on a particular site that isn't a good location, what characteristics make you feel that way? Is it because it's not right for the character, there's too much traffic or impact on public services or other kinds of issues? If it's a site that you think I think it's a great site, well, why do you think it's a great site? Because it's an underutilized site or because it's close to transit or employment? So just kind of be thinking about what it is that makes you like or not like a particular site. When your facilitator will have you do your introduction, they will ask you if there are any of the sites in particular that you want to talk about, because you do have a limited amount of time. So they do want to prioritize and make sure you get to cover the sites that you're most concerned with. And if you don't have any, that's okay too. We're going to try to cover as many as they can. You will have about 30 minutes in your small groups, and they'll also ask you for someone to volunteer to present the small group discussions back to the bigger group as well. So just a little prep for your getting into your small groups. We have, as I mentioned, we have our experts, Eric, Lardy, Scott, and Corey. They will be going in between all of the different groups to provide responses to questions or to give any kind of technical information that you might need. So they'll be available as well. And just one final note, if we have anyone that would like to speak in a Spanish only session, we have that available. And Melba, if I could just ask you to make that announcement, and then we'll see if anyone would like to have that be in that room and put you into a Spanish only speaking room. So Melba, I'll turn it over to you for a second.
Yes, thank you very much, Susan. Para las personas que deseen tener esta participación en la reunión en español, podrían estar en mi salón para poder hacer esta discusión en ese idioma, así que por favor levanten la mano y las podemos designar conmigo para tener esa posibilidad. Gracias.
We'll wait a second here to see if anyone would like to take advantage of that opportunity. And again, I appreciate all of the notes in the chat. We are taking note of those. Those are, and some of the ideas about what makes a site good or not so good are already coming out in the chat. And definitely want you to dig into some of the specific sites when you get into your small groups. So with that, I will have us launch into the small groups, and you'll get time checks periodically. So don't worry about that. Just have a great conversation. Getting everyone back in the room. Welcome back, everybody. We want to take hopefully you all had some great conversations. I dropped in most of the rooms and heard some good dialogue happening and getting some good feedback on the different choices that we have for sites. What we'd like to do now is get a short report from each of the rooms. So you know what happened in your room, but you don't know what was going on in the other 4 rooms. So we want to give everyone a sense of what the conversations were. And if there was some similarities, we want to be able to highlight some of those. So if I could start with room 1.
Yes, we had a lot of mostly sort of general questions and only some comments about a couple specific sites. I'm going to ask Blake to share some of the conversation since we did not get a volunteer from our group.
No volunteer, all right.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so just some of our general comments. We had quite a few concerns about building out housing in areas that have access to services and transportation. Low income doesn't always have access to cars. So, having it around public transportation is great. The other general concept that came up a lot was really making sure this housing is spread out a lot throughout the city, and the infrastructure is created to promote and sustain not only the new units, but all the housing around them. And finally, on the general side, we wanted to find out a little bit more about bridging the gap between the really low income housing needs and maybe the differences in what the mandates are. There were concerns that maybe these mandates weren't really addressing the low income folks that could use some help. And as far as specifics, we spoke about Site 4, and side there is access to bus service, but the concerns were there are already senior communities there, mobile homes, there's already a lot of traffic in the area. The overflow that's going to flow into the non-arterial roads, as also some environmental concerns to make sure that Agua Hedionda is taken care of and that all this new construction isn't going to really impact our environment here. And then on Site 8, there was concerns about how this is going to impact the existing neighborhoods. Apparently there is already an apartment building planned and in motion right there. And so the suggestion was perhaps we want to wait and see how that apartment complex does and how it impacts the neighborhoods before more housing is built there, and concerns about traffic, pollution, crime. So it's a pretty small area, and already a lot of houses are planned there. So they would like a wait and see kind of approach.
Great, thank you, Group 1. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and go to Group 2, see if Group 2 had a volunteer.
We didn't have a volunteer, but I was voluntold that I was the volunteer. This is Robin. Let me start my video. Yeah, let me give you a quick overview. We had a great discussion. Accessibility to transportation and walkability was important to many of the participants, as well as reducing vehicle miles traveled. We felt that should be a requirement. There were a couple different philosophies on density, with some folks in favor of higher density because it makes the developments more affordable and you can get more units for less money. We should be pushing for highest density possible on transit-oriented sites where we can put in bus stops and increase access to transportation. And then on the other side of that argument, people felt that the high density also could bring problems with parking, problems with the infrastructure would be too much to handle and too crowded. Some people liked the sites along Palomar Airport Road and industrial sites, and that these sites would be good because there's access to transportation and amenities, and also the road could handle the traffic, that if there was an increased traffic. There were some concerns about Site 1 and 2 being downtown, and there's already parking concerns. And Site 3, there were concerns about getting in and out of El Camino Real. There's already a lot of traffic. Although Sites 1 and 2, also some people thought that they were great sites because you could get in a lot of housing and there are a lot of amenities. So positives and negatives. Site 9, people liked the Palomar Airport Road sites. Let's see. 14, 15, and 17, folks liked that because it was near the train station. It would be walkable and reducing the vehicle miles traveled. And that was a basic overview of some of the things that our group said, and I made sure to get everything else in the notes.
Great, thank you. You guys got through a lot of sites in that small amount of time. Group 3.
Thank you. I am lucky to have Mr. Mornes as our spokesperson.
Terrific.
All right. Again, it's Jeff. Our group had a good conversation. I'll do my best to summarize some of the things that we spoke about. One individual had opposition to sites 16, 17, and 18. I think that was later kind of given another thumbs up from a few others, myself included, 17 and 18 particularly. And a lot of that kind of comes down to proximity to the ocean. Really anything, as you're going west, it just seems like from a fairness perspective, this was kind of brought up, that it just didn't seem fair that if somebody's paying for an affordable house on right next to the ocean with a view, but then you got somebody who's paying $2-3 million for the property right next to it. It just, there was a fairness factor there. But also going back to 16, 17, and 18, one of the individuals brought up just the fact that there's little hope for widening of La Costa Avenue and Carlsbad Boulevard, not enough parking for those that want to go to the beach. It'll impact the traffic, and low impact housing will still not be affordable. One of the other sites that was opposed was site 8. It was, again, close to the ocean, great schools. And then there was a talk about the other apartment that's already approved, kind of waiting to see how that pans out. And then also, I think we've discussed that site 9 was already approved on some of the PDFs that are here on the map that stated that back in May 2021, council has already approved that site. So you got site 9 that's already kind of given the green thumb and or the thumbs up, and site 8 really close by, and then another one that's already approved. So that was kind of some of the things. I listed off a few of my sites that I did favor: 14, 2, 7, 17, 5, 4, 18, 15, 3, whatever it was. Those are my least favorite, sorry. And then the sites that I found to be okay were 9, 8, 10, 19, 12, and 11, just to say it out loud, I guess, here. And then we kind of finished the conversation talking about Encinitas and how that they've kind of joined in with a lawsuit. And then there was one individual that said, you know, we need to just fill these 2,600, and we need to do it with the sites that are available here. Because basically we have to do them all, or pretty much all of them, to fulfill it. So we need to make it happen. Whereas there was some opposition in our group to that statement, saying that, you know, maybe the enough is enough. Pack and stack is happening enough. We're filling up our village. It's no longer getting to feel like a village anymore. And maybe we should be joining with our partner cities on the coastal here to do that. So what are the total fines? What are the total grant losses that would come if we lost all our grants, and what are the total lawyer fees or whatever fees that would come to be joining with the cities like Encinitas and others that are not fulfilling these requirements? So just something to bring up to the council, I guess, is that not everybody is in agreement that we need to fulfill all these, and maybe we should be considering that as well and what that cost would be. I think that covers it. Sorry if I missed anything, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jeff.
Jeff.
Group 4. Nikki, I think that was your group, right?
Okay. Yes. Last call. Anyone in our group? Okay. So yeah, big. We didn't get through as many sites, but I think a big picture kind of things that we were talking about was for more affordability, looking east of the 5. So those types of sites. There's pros and cons to the public transportation sites, such as number 17. It's great that it's, you know, at the Poinsettia station, but I think there's some caveats with that as far as like would housing, developing housing there completely take away parking, and just the challenges that come away with taking away parking and the parking ratio per housing unit, etc. But as a pro to that, just that the housing would be close to public transportation is good. One of the other sites that we talked about was site number 4 along El Camino Real. Again, pros and cons. As far as cons, El Camino Real is already congested. There's a lot of only one way in and out of some of the neighborhoods out there. And so there was some concerns about that. But on the flip side of it, site 4, there's kind of like 2 different zoning on that site right now. One already allows housing and could increase the units, and one is commercial. I think that as a general consensus, community members were okay with the parts of that site that were already allowed for housing, and so increasing density there and then keeping the commercial. We also talked about the sites 1 and 2 up in the north. If they were developing just the parking lots part of the mall area, there could be some benefits there as far as just like close to retail and shopping. It was nice that it's next to open space. Hosp Grove cannot be touched. But as another general theme, wanting to make sure that there was open space and parks next to any of the development sites that were chosen.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least, group 5.
Yes, we didn't have a volunteer, so our scribe is gonna give a summary of our conversation.
To go over 6 separate sites. It looks like one general comment would have been that the sites could be better spread out around the city. We went over sites 1 and 2 for the most part together. Site 1 looks like it had positive feedback in terms of traffic being able to better flow around that area, and that there's access to buses as well. A negative would be that it could lead to potential crime, with youth maybe being bored around the area. Site number 2 is that the parking lot at the mall is already underutilized, so it would be putting it to good use, and that the western portion of that site would likely be the better option. Negatives for site 2 would be that the area is already too congested with traffic, and there's a consideration about possibly what would happen with any homeless around the area. We also went over site number 3. The positive there was that there are schools nearby. Negatives would be that the area is already congested since it's so close to El Camino Real, and that the elementary school around there is already pretty full and then is not taking any more students. So, new tenants around the area might have to look elsewhere. And it could potentially look aesthetically off, just taking into consideration what's already built in the area. Next would be site number 8, which actually looks like our most popular. It had nothing but positive comments. So that would be because it was close to the freeway. It has, buses that travel around the area. Poinsettia Park is nearby. It's a quiet community near the coast. There's not a lot of traffic, and it's close to a lot of services. Next would be site number 14. That is a little bit split in half. It was a positive because it's close to the coaster. Also has access to services and schools, and that it's in the village, which is meant to be kind of dense. But then we also had comments about that being negative because the village is already so dense, and a lot of the comments did seem to focus on the loss of parking, which is a benefit for a lot of the businesses in the area, and losing that parking could be negative as far as the public utilizing that free parking. Then lastly, we went over site number 17, and that was just the cons also of losing parking in the area.
Great, thank you. Well, you all did an amazing job of really trying to look at the balancing of the pros and the cons. So I commend you on really trying to think of both. Certainly there seemed to be maybe more support for some of the across the groups on the Palomar Airport Road sites potentially. 1 and 2 with the amenities there seemed to be, there's definitely some support there, but there were also some cons too. On 17, same thing. There's quite a bit of support, and then quite a bit of caveats on, well, we got to consider parking as well. So I think that was similar across a lot of the sites. There was some support on 8, not some support on 8. So we'll really dig into the notes and really see what was being said about each of those. In terms of some of the general comments that seem to be overlapping across the groups is really making sure that there is access and availability of services, public transit, open space, and wanting to make sure that that's available. And also comments about spreading out and ensuring infrastructure is available as well. So those seem to be some comments. Certainly some discussion on maybe needing density to make housing more affordable for the lowest income, but then also some concerns going along with that higher density as well. So certainly was a good balance, I think, of comments and conversation. As I said, we'll be digging into the notes, and these will be combined with the notes, comments from last week's workshop, along with all of the comments from the survey, the online survey, to really get a better sense of each of the sites, along with some of the the criteria that you all feel is most important. So thank you very much to the facilitators and the note takers, along with all of you for your participation in those small groups. It really is helpful to have those smaller discussions where you can dig in a little bit more detail. We do want to switch gears. We have about a half an hour left, and we want to make sure we can hear from you. We're going to break this up into two kind of pieces. So we want to answer some of the questions that were pasted into the chat at the beginning of the meeting. And then we want to open it up for public comment, and then we'll come back and answer some of the questions that may come out during that public forum piece as well. So if Eric and Scott are ready, I'm going to pose some questions to the two of you, and you can maybe back and forth who you'd like to have answer those. So I'll start with some of the questions that were pasted into the chat earlier. Does state law requiring cities to have a certain amount of affordable housing apply to all cities and counties in California? And how does it relate to funding? And I know one of the groups was getting really into that. I think it might have been group 3, but if we could have either Scott or Eric take a stab at that one.
Yeah,
Eric?
So each city and county in California is required to have a housing element. They have a different number, but they have a number of housing units they're required to accommodate. Specific to funding, there are some grant programs that are associated, and you could get additional rankings related to that, but it's really just a requirement. And the flip side is there could be lawsuits and fines and penalties associated if a jurisdiction is not providing a housing element and enough housing. And those laws do change over time. They have been changing significantly over the last several years, but there have been some lawsuits filed against certain cities for not having housing elements.
And how would housing be built on government-owned property? Would the city sell the property to a developer, give it as a gift to be used for affordable housing? How would that work?
There's a couple different models, so it really depends. Not all the government-owned property in consideration is city-owned, but in short, it would essentially be leased or sold to an affordable housing developer or developer to provide housing.
Okay. There are 2 new housing bills, and we just moved this one up because it's kind of related to what we're talking about here. How will the 2 new housing bills passed by the governor, SB 9 and SB 10, impact Carlsbad?
Okay, so the 2 bills are very different. And so I'll give a brief overview for those that aren't aware of them. SB 9 is a bill that was signed in the last couple of weeks that would allow a duplex or up to a quadplex be constructed in essentially any single family zone in the state. That bill is mandatory, and so that bill will impact Carlsbad and other jurisdictions. It's not specifically in effect this exercise because we still need to accommodate those 2,600 units at higher densities. So if there's construction that occurs, we will look at it and we will be able to take credit for it, but likely those will be in the above moderate categories. SB 10 is not a mandatory bill. It would allow a jurisdiction to upzone property under certain circumstances without going through a CEQA process. It remains to be seen if that's something that the city of Carlsbad is interested in doing, but that's a voluntary process. We would expect that some cities will take advantage of that. Again, it wouldn't necessarily impact this effort because we're going to be required to upzone sites and spread them out, and these sites are not in the locations that would be exempted in SB 10.
Great, thank you. There was a question about whether developers of the sites that are eventually identified, would they be required to restrict tenants to just those with income levels identified for low and moderate?
They would not be required to restrict 100% of the units to those at those income levels. They'd be required to meet the city's inclusionary housing requirements, which would require them to make 15 to 20% at lower income levels.
And this question I'll put to Scott. There's a question goes to the distribution. Somebody asked why there are nearly no sites in the southeast quadrant, and would it make more sense to distribute more evenly across the city?
It certainly does make sense to distribute evenly. In fact, we have to do so by state law. Some new legislation that's passed in the past couple of years requires us to do just that, make sure affordable housing in particular is in locations where people, all economic segments have access to everything, whether it be school, recreation facilities, So with regards to the southeast quadrant in particular, there are a couple of sites that have been identified in Bressi Ranch. The challenge with the southeast quadrant is, despite the amount of vacant land that you might see there, that land generally has been set aside as habitat preserve. It's got a conservation easement on it. It's owned by a property owner that's interested in preserving land only for habitat purposes, and it's designated open space. So despite it being vacant, more likely than not, it's set aside for a purpose other than for development. But I do want to clarify as well that there are 4 large affordable housing projects already in the southeast quadrant. The southeast quadrant, as you might know, is developed with large master plan communities, villages of La Costa, Bressi Ranch. When you add up those affordable housing projects, they actually total 564 units. So there is at least that amount of affordable housing in that quadrant.
Thank you, Scott. And just a note, as we're answering some of these questions, if you do know that you'd like to share during the public forum, if you want to go ahead and just raise your hand now, so your virtual hand, so that we will definitely know we have how many people we have in line to speak. For site 2, there's a question about, this is the one of the shops of Carlsbad. Does the city get tax revenue from those stores? And would that be affected if housing is built around the shops?
The city does get tax revenue. The city gets sales tax revenue from retail sales within the city. The models that we've seen for similar types of sites are the housing is constructed in certain areas that are not currently stores. So for example, parking lots, structured parking of some form that would need to be made to accommodate loss of parking spaces for both the housing and for the retail. So we don't anticipate loss of sales tax with that site.
And another question about the RHNA numbers. How often does the state put out numbers for each city?
It's an 8-year cycle. So every 8 years. So we would anticipate the next cycles begin just before 2029.
And somebody asked a question about the net difference between the goal versus the sites proposed. And I'm not sure if maybe we need a little more.
I mean, I think somebody else actually answered it in the chat.
Yeah.
We're looking for about 2,600 units. It's over 3,000 units that are total proposed. And so we would be reporting back to City Council and asking them what to study in the environmental impact report, recognizing that some sites might be removed through this process.
Great. So why don't we'll take a break from questions for a second, and we'll go back to allowing for some of the folks with their hands raised. We'll give each person 2 minutes. And if you have a question, please feel free to pose that as well as make a comment, and we'll come back and answer some more questions before we close out the meeting as well. So Bob Wilcox, we'll start with you.
Hi. So I just wanted to emphasize that we really do have a responsibility to add housing. There's a huge housing crisis in the state, and especially in our region. We've been adding jobs without adding housing for decades, essentially. And so when you add all of these job sites and don't add housing, people have to commute in from elsewhere. And that's leads to traffic, it leads to long commutes, it leads to unaffordable housing anywhere near the jobs. And I own my house, but anyone my age or younger, it is incredibly difficult to afford housing in Southern California. And this is almost entirely a supply issue. So we really have a responsibility to build housing where it's going to cut down the most on traffic, where people can take the train, take buses, or if they're going to drive less of a distance. So instead of having people drive from Escondido to come to work in Carlsbad, they can live in Carlsbad and work in Carlsbad. And I think it's really important for cutting back on traffic, local pollution that affects climate emissions. It affects affordability. It's just such a huge issue. And so many of our problems of affordability just come down to not having enough housing where people can travel less distance to go to work and to go to the places that they need to go. So I think focusing on adding as much of the housing as we can near transit sites and job sites is super important. And the city should do its best to add as many of these units as they can. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Bob. How about Joe V? You can see your time, the time. I should have noted that there's a little timer up in the upper left corner if you can see that.
All right. So I spoke on Site 3 last week, and I mentioned a couple things. It's a very dangerous intersection. There are accidents there all the time. I think traffic studies need to be done, but I already know that it's pretty dangerous, and it's dangerous for the kids walking to school and walking home from school. Environmentally sensitive area. That was kind of brought up last week, but I wanted to add something else. So this is dug up by one of my neighbors. So there is actually an El Camino Real corridor development standards that the city council, it's from a city council resolution. It's number 7642. It was from February 8th, 1984. So it goes back, but it may still be valid. It's a 12-page document that explains exactly how that corridor can be developed. And I've looked at some of them, and the site already appears to not follow those standards. It's too close to the street, for one thing. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you, Joe. With Marion, Nancy, then Dolores. So Marion, you want to unmute yourself? Marion, you're still muted. I'm not sure if you're trying to talk. We'll come back to you, Marion, if you're having some audio issues. Oh,
sorry, here we go.
There you are.
Okay,
Perfect.
Question, because things are related to other things. So in the village, do they have any plans for any parking? Like by the train station where there's the parking lot right now? Or are they just thinking about filling that in with some low income housing? And then the second thing is, I think we should go inland for a lot of different reasons. There's Bressie, you've got Bressie Ranch. I mean, not everybody doesn't have a car. I mean, I don't know that many Carlsbad people who don't have a car. I have a son that, you know, had to move to Michigan to afford, but they still have 2 cars and they had them here. So I don't think that's going to alleviate. I don't think people are driven there yet to the transportation, but they need to be around shopping. The village has no shopping. So I'm adverse to the village. That's why I want to know about the parking, but I'm not adverse to number 2. If there was a model that can be shown how those would be built around an existing shopping center.
Thank you, Marion. We'll add that question into our list of questions to answer. Nancy, you'd like to unmute?
There, I got it. Do we not still think that we have an obligation to keep beautiful areas beautiful? That there is a finite number of people and vehicles that can live in an area? I can't help but think of Los Angeles, which was a paradise, and now it's a nightmare. I look at Encinitas. I wouldn't want to live in Encinitas. They've built out all 4 borders. I don't want to see that happen to Carlsbad. I want us to be able to keep our charm and our open space, and at the same time provide some housing that is affordable. I already live in a high density area. I'm lucky. Tanglewood has such huge greenbelt areas. We feel like we live in a park, but I just don't want to see us built out. In fact, I'd like to see a moratorium on building as soon as we take care of getting some more affordable housing. Back in the day when you were talking 84 and earlier, it was probably my boss, Fred Morey, that you're talking about. He did that master plan. And back then, late 70s, early 80s, we actually did have a building moratorium for a few years, and it was nice.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Dolores.
I just want to clarify the 3,000 houses that are going to be built that Eric talked about. That's not the total number of houses. That's just low income houses.
We'll answer that question as well, or maybe Eric, if you just want to answer that one and we can go backwards through some of the questions. Oh, we do have another hand up. So Dolores, if you're okay, we'll add that question to our queue, but there's definitely, we can clarify that for you, okay?
Okay.
Diane.
Is this the time for statements?
Yes, you have 2 minutes.
The suburbs have always been a great place to raise a family, get away from congestion, pollution, and crime of dense urban cities, have room to play in a backyard and be able to drive a car rather than be forced to take public transportation. This is part of the American dream, which citizens of all races, color, ethnicity, and religion have worked hard to attain during the history of our country's democracy. But it seems our local governments, along with the interests of developers, are set on taking that dream away from the middle class. Instead, a vision of overpopulated cities and suburbs with box-like stacked, high-density subsidized housing seems to be what our current leadership, local and county, wants for all citizens. In other words, we no longer have a choice. High-density subsidized housing in the suburbs impacts schools, which are already overcrowded. This type of housing will impact sewer capacity. Where will the stormwater go? There will be more concrete and less green to absorb it. More flood hazards will be created, not to mention the availability of clean water. Have you seen the levels of our local reservoirs lately? And how much and how quickly the levels have diminished due to our growing population? Increased population means less street capacity for cars, bicycles, and our empty buses. Homeowners will lose their privacy because the size of setbacks will be greatly reduced, therefore increasing exposure to noise from neighbors and disease, such as we are seeing right now in the densely populated communities hit hard by COVID. Also, the plan allows for unrealistic minimal parking requirements by the developer in exchange for higher density. Who benefits from all this? I ask our elected leaders to please be responsible and reasonable while considering all the impacts high density housing will have on our beautiful city. Please fight back. Please fight back against these unrealistic, tyrannical mandates.
Thanks, Diane. Jeff, you're up. And be sure to unmute. There you go.
Yes. All right. I just wanted to kind of share what are my least favorite sites, which ones are my favorite sites. Before I do that though, I wanted to kind of reiterate the statement that I mentioned from the group before and how it's not necessarily a requirement. I think it was Eric Lardy, you had said that we are required to do this by state. And I get that that's what the state is saying, that we are required, but we can challenge that. As the city, if the people are saying that enough is enough, we don't want this stacked, then the city should be looking to find ways to say this is enough. And that requirement can be fought back. What are the total costs from a lawsuit perspective? What are the total costs from a fines perspective? What loss in grants? I know that in one of the paperworks that was in here, it was $310,000 for a grant. Yes, that's lost. But what does that total up to? And what Diane so delicately, or what she just stated, all those things we're losing by adding all this in. So as a person of the community, am I willing to pay that fine, that fee, that loss of grant, and join in with other cities from a lawsuit perspective in order to maintain the village that we have here in Carlsbad? So besides that, I just wanted to really quick with my 34 seconds is, if I did have to choose a site, I mean, there are some decent sites here. I know Scott had mentioned some examples of sites early on, and the one right by Agua de Niando, that's a beautiful site, but the moment you start making it, $800, $1,000 for rent, then it doesn't seem fair. But if it's a site with high density, but you let the market dictate the pricing, I'm okay with it. So I'll let my survey speak to the ones I like and don't like, so I don't have time to do that. But thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Dolores, I'm going to wait on you if you don't mind, because you spoke, but I'm going to let Howard make a comment, and then I do want to get to some more of our questions because we are running short on time here. But Howard?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment. To make these housing RHNA numbers for low-income housing, developers have been getting these density bonus projects that override all local concerns by putting in only, I think it's been 15% of what they build as low-income housing. And maybe it's been, Encinitas just raised that, I think, to 20. But there's no reason why they can't be required to have something like 40% or even more of the units low income. That way, we can meet some of these numbers without having to build 6 times as many apartment units just to get a little bit of low income housing. And I think the city needs to look into that. As okay. Also, I agree with everyone that it doesn't need to be in the beach area or downtown, which is already severely impacted by traffic, and there's some fairness issues as well.
Great. Thank you, Howard. Oh, sorry, were you not? Thank you, Howard. So in the interest of time, I want to do a couple things. There were a couple of questions that Dolores and I forget one of our other community members asked. And I want to make sure we answer those. For some of the other questions that have been into the chat, we're going to get through a few more of them, but they keep coming, which is great. There's lots of questions. We are going to organize them into some categories and themes, and we will prepare a more detailed kind of FAQ that'll be available on the website. So rather than try to rush through answering all the questions, there's some that have some overlap and some similarities, and so we'll be able to kind of answer them in another fashion. But I did promise Dolores we would clarify that the 3,000 number. And so Eric, if you could address that question that Dolores had asked about, are the 3,000 all affordable units?
Okay, so again, we're required to accommodate approximately 4,000 units as part of our RHNA for this 8-year cycle. We counted existing projects, existing zoned. We satisfied all of our above moderate, and we were left with a shortfall of about 1,600 units. Considering that we need to have a buffer for things that are going to occur over the next 8 years, we're looking at rezoning approximately 2,600 units for low, very low, and moderate income. We need to zone that in capacity. It's likely that as those move forward, a good portion of those would be market rate units, and then other units would be in place through the city's inclusionary housing ordinances at about 15 to 20%. So I hope that clarified a little bit of kind of the different numbers and what we're required to do versus what may happen.
And I think you've said this too, Eric, and so has Scott, but when we're talking about these numbers, the city is not building the housing, just creating the places for them so that if someone is able to build them, they can. So just to clarify that too, I think there were a couple comments about the city building housing. And then there was a question about what's planned for parking in the village that came up in the public forum as well. And so maybe Scott, if you're able to provide any insight into some of the plans for the village parking.
Well, and I think there's two separate things here. One is discussion about an overall city parking structure that would or would not happen regardless of this housing element. That's an entirely different matter that's not related to this effort. But there's also talk about a potential parking structure on North County Transit District's property, the train station. If that property were to redevelop, say with some residential uses, perhaps it might include a parking structure. I'm sure their primary tenants of that structure would be the transit users themselves, but potentially some of the spaces could be set aside for public use as well. Whether it would be free or not, I don't know.
Thank you. So that addresses to the questions there. We have about a couple minutes left for questions. We do want to make sure that we tell you some next steps and what to expect from here. Dolores, I'm going to go ahead and let you make your final comment, and then we'll ask a couple more questions or answer a couple more questions.
This is just my final comment. I asked that question about low income housing because according to Encinitas, which now has a lot of by right developments coming on, there will be 1,765 market rate units for 328 low income housing. And the 48 houses that are being built just off La Costa and I-5, there are 48 houses. It's not a by right, it's just a density bonus. And of the 48, only 4 are low interest, low cost housing. So if you're having 3,000, you're hoping for 3,000, that means you're really packing them in. And I want to be sure people know that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. And I'm going to go ahead and let Eric answer a few of these questions, maybe a little on speed dating style. We'll get through a few of them before we turn it back over to Scott to close out our presentation. So Eric, if you want to take a few of them.
So one of the questions we received is, what is the exact penalty for not meeting the state's mandate? We can follow up with that. One of the reasons it's difficult to answer is it has not happened a significant amount of times. There have been several lawsuits filed through the Attorney General's office, but we're not aware of fines or anything like that on those. One of the questions was, why doesn't Carlsbad include existing approved housing projects in future plan proposals, for example, Aviara Apartments? Those are included. So we have included approved projects, and it's part of that reduction when we went from 4,000 down to the 2,600. One of them is, please explain how water would be provided for those. That is something that we'll be reaching out to the water and sewer districts. We recognize that we are again in a drought situation, but we are still required to plan for these. But we will be reaching out to them and asking for comments and clarification on their short-term and long-term plans. There was a question on the new state law, I believe reference to SB 10 and the specific requirements within half mile of a transit hub. That one's hard to answer quickly. I'd encourage anybody to look at the state law themselves, but I will reiterate that is a completely optional law. And so city jurisdictions would have to take action to opt into that. From there.
Great, thank you, Eric. I think that probably is good for now in order to get people home. And I guess most of you are already home, to get you back to your families on time. So I do want to turn the floor back over to Scott to just give us a little sense of what's to come. And so we'll share a couple more slides here. Or maybe Scott, you are doing the final slides, right?
Yeah, actually, I can just talk without use of slides. That works. And so first of all, thank you everybody for your participation. Just to wrap this meeting up, the input you've provided tonight, the input from the last virtual meeting we had last Wednesday, all of the comments will be transmitted to our city council. We anticipate having a meeting with the city council early next year, perhaps February, at which time those comments will be presented along with a request from staff to have the city council identify the sites that we will then proceed with environmental review, and ultimately to present back to the city council in late 2022, early 2023 for formal adoption hearings for them to actually consider redesignating properties. But of course, in between then and now, there will be other public comment opportunities, not only at that meeting early next year, but also as part of the environmental review document that will also come out sometime in 2022. If you have any questions, need any additional information, we do have a website. You can see there on the slide, carlsbadca.gov housing plan. That contains a lot of information, including links to informational bulletins that might help answer your questions about what if the city or a city does not comply with state law, what some of the ramifications are, as well as an information bulletin on accessory dwelling units. My contact information is also provided on this page, so feel free to shoot me a question if you have one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for participating tonight. This was a great, lively discussion. Lots of content in the chat, lots of questions that we, again, will respond to the themes of questions and get you some more information there. A reminder about the online survey that's available at the city's website, but we're also pasting the online survey link into the chat, and we really encourage you to, even if you participated and you feel like you gave some input here, we'd love to have your input also into the online survey. Please share that with your neighbors and friends as well. And then just a note that you will receive notification from the city on what the next steps are. So Scott described some of those, but if you're worried about trying to keep track of all those dates, now that you've been on, you signed up for this workshop, you're on the list, the email list, so you'll get direct notices of all things that are happening around the housing plan. And with that, thank you everyone for your time, and we really appreciate you giving us the last 2 hours.